The HOA built their entire image around control. Clean fences, private trails, uniform mailboxes, matching barns. They acted like they owned the valley. Most of the people living there believed they did. Then I inherited 2,300 acres surrounding the entire development. The road they used every day cut directly through my land. It always had. My grandfather allowed access through a private easement back in the late 1970s when the first homes were built. It was supposed to stay simple, quiet, respectful. But over the years, the HOA board started treating my property like it belonged to them. They ignored survey lines, they damaged gates, they threatened my ranch hands. Then they tried forcing me to follow HOA rules on land that was never part of their community. So I pulled every county record my grandfather ever kept. And 6 months later, I closed the only road out. My grandfather bought this land after returning home from Vietnam. Back then, the valley was mostly cattle country and timber fields. Roads were gravel. Power lines barely reached the western ridge. He slowly purchased parcels over 20 years until he controlled most of the surrounding acreage. By the time he passed, the ranch covered 2,300 acres across hills, pasture, creek beds, and forest sections. My father managed it after him. Then it came to me. I was 43 when the inheritance finalized. I had spent most of my adult life working agricultural contracts in neighboring counties. I understood permits, land use, water rights, fencing law, easements, and county access rules better than most attorneys in town. I also understood something else. Paperwork matters more than emotion. That lesson came from my grandfather. He documented everything. Every handshake became a signed note. Every boundary adjustment had maps attached. Every agreement went into labeled filing cabinets stored in a climate-controlled room beside the old equipment barn. Most people thought he was paranoid. He wasn't. He simply lived long enough to know memory changes when money gets involved. The HOA community sat near the southern edge of my property. About 80 upscale homes wrapped around a small artificial lake developers built in the early 1980s. The residents called it Cedar Hollow Estates. At first, we barely interacted. I leased grazing sections to neighboring ranchers. I maintained the timber roads. I repaired fences myself when storms knocked trees across the property lines. Quiet life suited me. The HOA residents mostly stayed near their paved streets and clubhouse. That changed after property values exploded. New board members arrived, retired executives, real estate investors. People from larger cities looking for country living with strict neighborhood control. They wanted the valley to look curated, and eventually they started looking at my land like it was unfinished scenery surrounding their subdivision. That was the beginning of the problem. For the first year after I inherited the ranch, I stayed mostly invisible. That was intentional. I repaired old fencing along the northern ridge, cleared dead cedar after winter storms, renewed 2 grazing leases my father had managed for years. Most mornings started before sunrise. Coffee in a steel thermos, fence tools in the truck bed, radio turned low. I liked the silence out there. The ranch was large enough that you could drive 40 minutes and never see another person. Deer crossed the creek bottoms at dusk. Wild turkeys nested near the western hills. During summer evenings, the wind carried the smell of pine and dry grass across the valley. My grandfather protected that quiet carefully. He hated unnecessary attention. So did my father. The HOA residents, though, were becoming louder every year. Cedar Hollow Estates had started as a modest private development decades earlier. But once wealthy buyers moved in, the place changed. Large custom homes replaced older cabins. Decorative stone gates appeared at the entrance. Security patrols started driving the private streets. Then came the rules. Mailbox color regulations. Approved fence materials, restrictions on outdoor equipment, limits on livestock visibility near residential areas. None of that involved me. My ranch had never been part of the HOA. Legally, it sat completely outside their authority. But the newer board members did not seem to understand that distinction. Or maybe they simply didn't care. The first sign of trouble came through small things. One afternoon, I found orange survey flags pushed 30 feet past the actual property line near the south pasture. Someone had marked part of my grazing field with white spray paint. At first, I assumed it was a contractor mistake. Then I saw wooden stakes labeled future walking trail expansion. I removed every marker before sunset. The next morning, they were back. This time I drove directly to the HOA office beside the clubhouse. A woman named Denise Harper managed the board then, former corporate attorney, early 60s, always dressed like she was heading into a business conference. She smiled before I even sat down, not a friendly smile, the kind people use when they already think they're in charge. She told me the HOA planned to improve community access around the Southern Lake area. According to her, residents wanted extended nature trails for recreation. I explained calmly that the proposed trail crossed private ranch land. She barely reacted. Instead, she slid a printed map across the desk and pointed at the access road cutting through my property. "Well," she said, "your family has always cooperated with the community before." That sentence told me everything. Cooperation had slowly become entitlement. I told her the existing easement only covered roadway access, nothing else. No trails, no recreational use, no expansion rights. She leaned back in her chair. Then she said something I never forgot. "Large landowners sometimes struggle adjusting to modern community standards." I remember staring at her for a second, honestly unsure whether she understood how insulting that sounded. My family owned the valley before most of Cedar Hollow even existed, but I stayed calm. I told her to remove the survey markers immediately and send me any future proposals through certified mail. Then I left. 3 days later, one of my ranch hands found HOA contractors cutting brush 15 feet inside my southern fence line. That was the first direct violation, and it would not be the last. I drove down to the south fence immediately after my ranch hand called. By the time I arrived, 3 contractors had already cleared a strip nearly 200 yards long. Fresh cedar branches were piled beside the fence. Tire tracks cut deep through the wet ground from their equipment. One man was operating a brush cutter near the property markers my father installed years earlier. I shut the truck off and walked the line slowly before saying anything. That mattered. People talk differently when they realize you understand exactly what they damaged. The fence posts were still standing, but several wire sections had been loosened to make room for equipment access. Fresh paint markings crossed directly into my pasture. I asked who authorized the work. One of the contractors pointed toward a white HOA SUV parked near the gravel shoulder. Denise Harper stood beside it holding a clipboard. She looked annoyed to see me there, not surprised, annoyed. I asked her again whether she understood the crews were operating on private property. She responded like she was explaining something obvious to a child. According to her, the HOA believed the unused land beside the roadway fell under Community Beautification Authority, connected to the easement agreement. There is no such thing, not legally. Easements are specific, extremely specific, especially roadway easements. Access rights do not magically become landscaping authority because an HOA wants prettier views for residents. But Denise spoke with total confidence. That was the dangerous part. Confident people often convince themselves the law works emotionally instead of contractually. I told the contractors to stop work immediately. To their credit, they did. Most contractors do not want involvement in property disputes once ownership becomes unclear. They packed equipment quietly while Denise continued arguing beside the road. She kept repeating variations of the same phrase. "This land affects the community." I finally told her something simple. Affecting the community does not transfer ownership. That ended the conversation. Or at least I thought it did. The next morning I contacted the county recorder's office and requested certified copies of every easement tied to Cedar Hollow Estates. Then I pulled my grandfather's original development agreements from storage. The paperwork took most of the afternoon to organize. By sunset, I had confirmation of exactly what I already suspected. The HOA possessed one narrow private access easement for roadway travel only. Width limitations were clearly defined. Maintenance obligations were shared. Recreational use was specifically excluded in handwritten amendments my grandfather added decades earlier. Excluded, in writing, signed by both parties. I scanned every page into digital files that night. Then I sent a formal cease and desist notice through certified mail to the HOA office, including photographs of the unauthorized clearing activity and copies of the easement language. I kept the letter professional. No threats, no emotion, just facts. I assumed that would settle things. Instead, the violations became worse. Over the next month, residents started treating parts of my ranch like open community space. I found hikers crossing cattle fields south of the lake, mountain bikes using maintenance trails near my timber section, dog waste left beside water troughs. One family even set up folding chairs near the creek during a weekend picnic. At first, I blamed confusion. Then I discovered the HOA newsletter. Denise had published a community update describing the southern ranch sections as shared natural areas adjacent to Cedar Hollow recreational expansion planning. Shared. That single word changed everything, because now the board was not merely overstepping. They were actively redefining ownership in the minds of residents. And people who believe land is communal stop respecting boundaries very quickly. I started documenting everything after that, not casually, systematically. My grandfather taught me long ago that property disputes are rarely won during arguments. They are won months later inside conference rooms and court records, when one side has organized evidence and the other side has opinions. So I treated the situation like a legal file from the beginning. I installed new trail cameras along the southern boundary, 12 total, motion activated, time stamped. I positioned them near fence crossings, creek access points, and along the private road easement. Within 48 hours, the cameras captured residents walking directly through posted pasture sections. Some ignored the warning signs completely, others moved them aside. One man cut a wire section near the south gate instead of walking around it. I photographed the damage before repairing it myself. Then came the ATVs. Teenagers from Cedar Hollow started using old maintenance trails on the western hills during weekends. Those trails were never designed for recreational traffic. They crossed steep grades near erosion-sensitive areas my family had protected for years. The noise alone caused problems with cattle movement, but what worried me more was liability. If someone rolled an ATV on my land, lawyers would eventually become involved whether I wanted them there or not. So I contacted the HOA board again. This time I requested a formal meeting. They scheduled it for the following Thursday evening inside the Cedar Hollow clubhouse. I arrived early, carrying copies of the easement documents, photographs, maps, and incident logs. 5 board members sat across from me at a polished wooden table. Denise chaired the meeting. I explained the situation calmly. Unauthorized access, fence damage, recreational trespassing, safety concerns, liability exposure. Then I placed the easement agreement in front of them and highlighted the exact clauses limiting usage rights. For a moment, nobody spoke. One older board member actually looked uncomfortable reading the language. Denise did not. She pushed the document aside and claimed the community had used surrounding land informally for decades without issue. That argument appears often in property disputes. People confuse tolerated behavior with legal rights. My grandfather occasionally allowed residents to fish near the creek years ago. My father permitted temporary access during wildfire evacuations once. None of that created ownership interests. Permission is not surrender. I explained that clearly. Again, Denise barely reacted. Instead, she shifted the discussion toward what she called community expectations. According to her, restricting access now would create tension between the ranch and residents. I remember looking around the table, realizing something important. They already viewed my property as emotionally connected to the HOA, not legally connected, emotionally connected. That mindset becomes dangerous because emotions ignore boundaries that contracts enforce. The meeting ended without resolution. 2 days later, the HOA maintenance crew installed wooden trail signs beside the south roadway easement. Not on HOA property, on mine. The signs labeled different walking routes around the valley. One even included arrows directing residents toward the creek crossing behind my equipment barn. That was the moment I understood the problem was no longer confusion. It was strategy. The board believed gradual normalization would eventually pressure me into compliance. If enough residents started using the land openly, challenging them later would appear unreasonable. Slow expansion, quiet assumption, public pressure. I had seen tactics like that before in agricultural access disputes. So I stopped thinking like a landowner dealing with rude neighbors and started thinking like someone preparing for litigation. The first thing I did was hire a survey crew. Not because I doubted the property lines, I knew exactly where they were. But official disputes require current documentation, not personal certainty. 3 licensed surveyors spent 8 days mapping the southern boundary sections around Cedar Hollow Estates. They marked every easement dimension with fresh steel pins and fluorescent stakes. GPS coordinates were logged into certified reports. I walked portions of the survey with the lead engineer myself. Every measurement confirmed the same thing. The HOA had repeatedly crossed onto private land beyond the legal roadway easement. In some areas, their trail markers extended over 70 feet past authorized access zones. I sent the completed survey package to the HOA through certified mail along with another formal notice demanding immediate removal of all unauthorized signs and recreational markers. Again, I stayed professional. No insults, no threats, just documented violations. The response came from the HOA attorney 5 days later. That changed the tone entirely. The letter accused me of hostile interference with established community use patterns. According to their attorney, residents had developed what he described as reasonable recreational expectations over time. I read the phrase twice. Reasonable recreational expectations. It sounded impressive until you remembered property law does not operate on feelings. The attorney also claimed the HOA might pursue legal remedies if I attempted to restrict resident access to historically utilized open areas. That line interested me, because it revealed their strategy clearly for the first time. They were preparing to argue implied usage rights through long-term tolerated access. In other words, if enough residents had wandered across the land long enough without objection, the HOA hoped a court might eventually recognize broader practical access rights. That kind of argument occasionally works in narrow cases, but only when property owners fail to document objections consistently. My grandfather never failed at documentation. Neither did I. I spent the next 2 weeks pulling every archived ranch record connected to Cedar Hollow Estates. Old correspondence, maintenance invoices, easement amendments, gate repair logs, insurance notices, county filings. The deeper I dug, the clearer the situation became. My grandfather anticipated this exact problem decades earlier. Buried inside a storage cabinet, I found a handwritten memorandum dated 1984 between him and the original developer of Cedar Hollow. The document specifically warned against future HOA expansion attempts beyond the roadway easement. One sentence stood out immediately. Temporary accommodation shall never be interpreted as permanent public access. Signed by both men, notarized. That memo alone could destroy half the HOA's argument. But I kept digging anyway. Then I found something even more important. The original roadway easement included a conditional maintenance clause requiring the HOA to maintain drainage ditches, culverts, and runoff control along the access road. They had not done that in years. I drove the full road the next morning documenting erosion damage with photographs and drone footage. Several drainage systems were partially collapsed. Runoff channels overflowed during storms. One damaged culvert had already started weakening the road shoulder itself. Legally, neglected easement maintenance can become a serious problem, because easement rights often depend on compliance with original conditions. And suddenly the HOA was not just violating boundaries. They might also be breaching the agreement keeping their only road operational in the first place. That realization changed the entire direction of the conflict. I stopped focusing on trespassing and started focusing on leverage. I hired an easement attorney from 2 counties over, not because local lawyers were incapable. I simply wanted someone without social ties to Cedar Hollow residents. Small towns create quiet pressure. Country club friendships have a way of influencing disputes before they ever reach court. My attorney's name was Daniel Mercer, former agricultural litigation specialist. Calm voice, precise language, the kind of man who read every document twice before speaking once. I sent him copies of everything: surveys, easement agreements, photographs, HOA correspondence, maintenance records, my grandfather's archived memorandums. 3 days later, he called me. His first sentence was short. They have a serious problem. According to Mercer, the HOA attorney made a major mistake threatening legal action while simultaneously ignoring mandatory easement maintenance obligations. The neglected drainage systems alone created potential liability exposure if roadway failure ever occurred. More importantly, the original easement language strongly favored my family. The agreement repeatedly described access as limited, conditional, and revocable upon material breach. That last phrase mattered most. Revocable upon material breach. Mercer explained that courts take easement conditions seriously when documentation is clear and violations are consistent. If the HOA materially breached maintenance obligations while simultaneously expanding unauthorized usage, a judge could potentially narrow or suspend portions of their access rights until compliance was restored. I asked him the obvious question. Could the road actually be closed? There was a pause on the line before he answered. Possibly, under the right conditions. That was the first moment I realized how exposed the HOA truly was. For years, they operated under the assumption that access through my land was permanent and untouchable. Most residents probably never even considered the legal structure beneath the road itself. But easements are not ownership. They are conditional agreements, and conditions can fail. Mercer advised me not to escalate publicly yet. Instead, he wanted stronger evidence showing a consistent pattern of HOA overreach and contractual neglect. So I continued documenting everything. Over the next month, the situation worsened almost weekly. Residents began walking directly around locked ranch gates. Someone removed 2 private property signs near the creek crossing. Tire tracks appeared beside restricted pasture areas after heavy rain. Then one Saturday morning, I found a yoga class happening near my southern meadow. 12 people. Exercise mats spread across grazing land my cattle used regularly. An HOA wellness instructor was leading stretches beneath cottonwood trees while parked vehicles lined the private easement road nearby. Nobody asked permission. Nobody even seemed concerned they were trespassing. I stood there for a full minute watching the scene quietly. That moment stayed with me longer than most of the larger confrontations, because it showed how completely the boundaries had dissolved inside their minds. The land no longer belonged to someone else in their view. It existed as an extension of their lifestyle. I photographed everything from the road before leaving. Later that afternoon, I sent another formal notice through my attorney demanding immediate cessation of organized activities on private ranch property. The HOA responded with silence. Not denial, not apology, silence. Then came the incident that changed public perception inside Cedar Hollow completely. During a heavy storm in early October, part of the neglected drainage system beneath the easement road collapsed near the southern entrance curve. Half the shoulder washed out overnight, and suddenly the only road connecting 80 upscale homes to the highway was unstable. County inspectors arrived the next morning. Orange barricades went up immediately around the damaged section of road. Traffic narrowed to a single alternating lane while engineers evaluated the collapse underneath the asphalt shoulder. Residents were furious, not at the HOA, at me. That part almost impressed me. Years of entitlement had conditioned people to treat my land as background scenery supporting their lives. So when the road failed on property I owned, many residents instinctively assumed I should solve the problem regardless of who caused it. My phone started ringing before noon. Most calls came from HOA residents I had never even met. Some were polite at first, others were openly demanding. They complained about delayed commutes, school traffic, delivery trucks, emergency access concerns. One man told me property values could drop if the issue wasn't fixed immediately. I listened quietly. Then I repeated the same sentence every time. The HOA is responsible for easement maintenance under the recorded agreement. Nothing more. By afternoon, Denise Harper requested an emergency board meeting with me and the county engineers. We met beside the damaged roadway under light rain while inspectors examined the collapsed culvert beneath the shoulder. The county engineer's report was direct. Years of deferred drainage maintenance caused erosion beneath the road base. Water undermined the support structure until the shoulder finally failed during the storm. Preventable damage. That phrase mattered, because preventable damage creates liability. Denise tried redirecting the conversation almost immediately. She claimed the county shared responsibility for inspections. Then she suggested unusually severe rainfall contributed to the collapse. The engineers disagreed politely but firmly. Maintenance neglect was the primary issue. Mercer attended the meeting beside me, taking notes quietly. He barely spoke until Denise eventually asked whether I intended to authorize immediate repair access across additional ranch sections. That was the moment everything shifted, because now they needed something from me, urgently. Before answering, Mercer asked a simple question. Will the HOA first acknowledge the existing easement violations and unauthorized land usage documented over the past several months? Denise avoided the question completely. Instead, she accused me of using the road collapse as leverage against the community. Mercer remained calm. No, he said. The community used private property without authorization while neglecting the legal obligations attached to its access rights. Silence followed that sentence. Even the county inspectors stopped talking for a moment. The facts were becoming harder to ignore publicly, especially now that official reports existed. By evening, residents started arguing inside community forums and neighborhood social media groups. Some blamed the board for ignoring infrastructure responsibilities. Others insisted I should cooperate for the good of the valley. That phrase appeared constantly. For the good of the valley. Interesting how people discover community language only when consequences arrive. The next week, Mercer filed a formal demand for corrective action against the HOA, citing material breach of easement obligations, unauthorized property expansion, recurring trespassing incidents, and liability exposure. The letter included a deadline, 30 days. Either the HOA would acknowledge and cure the violations, or we would petition the court for relief involving suspension of non-essential easement usage rights until compliance was restored. That filing terrified the board, because for the first time, road access itself had become legally vulnerable, and deep down they knew the documentation was against them. The HOA board responded exactly the way arrogant organizations usually do when they start losing control. They doubled down. Instead of accepting responsibility, Denise Harper hired a larger law firm from the city. Within days, residents received community emails describing the situation as an aggressive land use dispute initiated by a hostile neighboring property owner. That neighboring property owner was me, the man whose family had owned the valley before Cedar Hollow existed. But facts were becoming inconvenient for the board, so they shifted toward narrative management instead. The emails painted the HOA as victims protecting community stability against an unreasonable ranch owner threatening public safety. They conveniently left out the maintenance failures, the unauthorized trail expansion, the organized trespassing, the neglected drainage systems. Mercer expected that strategy immediately. Once documentation turns against people, he told me, they stop arguing law and start arguing emotion. He was right. Residents began posting online about school buses, emergency vehicles, elderly homeowners, and ambulance access. The board encouraged the idea that I intended to isolate the neighborhood completely. I never said that once. Not publicly, not privately. But fear spreads faster than paperwork. Then local media got involved. A regional news station aired a short segment describing tensions between a rural landowner and a luxury HOA community over road access concerns. The report lacked detail but generated attention across the county. That same night, someone cut the lock on my south equipment gate. Nothing was stolen, which told me the vandalism was emotional, not criminal. The following weekend became worse. Dozens of residents walked the southern roadway carrying signs demanding fair access rights and community cooperation. Several crossed directly onto my pasture during the demonstration. One woman hammered temporary protest signs into the ground beside my cattle fencing. I documented everything from a distance. No confrontation, no shouting. That restraint mattered more than people realize. Because emotional people expose themselves eventually if you remain calm long enough. Mercer advised me to continue building evidence instead of reacting publicly. So while the HOA staged community outrage, we focused on records, and the records became devastating. County engineers completed their final infrastructure assessment 2 weeks later. The report confirmed multiple maintenance failures along the easement corridor dating back years. Several drainage structures were classified as high-risk deterioration points. One section specifically warned continued neglect could create broader roadway instability during future storms. That report changed county involvement immediately. Officials started asking the HOA detailed questions about maintenance budgeting and repair history. The answers were bad, very bad. Through disclosure requests, Mercer discovered the board had repeatedly diverted infrastructure funds toward cosmetic projects inside Cedar Hollow. Decorative landscaping, clubhouse renovations, security upgrades, lake beautification. Meanwhile, the easement drainage systems keeping their only access road stable received minimal maintenance for nearly 6 years. Residents did not know that yet, but they would soon. Then Mercer uncovered the detail that shifted the entire legal landscape. The HOA insurance carrier had already warned the board 18 months earlier about drainage liability exposure along the roadway easement. Written warning. Ignored. At that point, this stopped looking like an unfortunate infrastructure dispute. It started looking like institutional negligence. And suddenly, Denise Harper was not just managing angry homeowners anymore. She was managing potential personal liability. That pressure began changing her behavior fast. Because people act confident right until accountability becomes individual. About a week later, Denise requested a private meeting. Not at the clubhouse, not through attorneys. She asked to meet at a small restaurant 20 miles outside the valley. Neutral ground. Mercer advised me to go, but warned me not to discuss anything without documentation afterward. So I drove there on a Tuesday afternoon carrying a notebook and recorder in my truck, though I left the recorder locked inside. State law allowed recordings under certain conditions, but I preferred cleaner methods. Paper trails survive better than emotional conversations. Denise arrived early. For the first time since this started, she looked tired. No clipboard, no polished confidence, just a woman realizing the situation had grown larger than expected. She started carefully. According to her, the board wanted practical cooperation before the dispute damaged the community permanently. She suggested temporary access expansions, shared trail management discussions, and possible future partnerships between the ranch and Cedar Hollow. I listened without interrupting. Then I asked one question. Will the HOA formally acknowledge the easement violations and maintenance failures? Her expression changed immediately. That was the line she could not cross, because acknowledgement meant liability, not just organizational liability, personal liability for board decisions made after receiving engineer warnings and legal notices. So instead of answering, she shifted directions. She implied prolonged conflict might create unpleasant public attention for everyone involved. Local officials, media scrutiny, environmental reviews, tax assessments, subtle pressure. Not quite threats, but close enough. I remember staring at her for several seconds, realizing something important. She still believed influence mattered more than documents. People like Denise spend years succeeding through pressure, networking, and confidence. They assume every problem eventually bends socially if enough leverage is applied. But land law does not care about social standing. A signed easement agreement from 1979 carries more authority than any HOA board ever will. I ended the meeting politely after less than 30 minutes. That evening, Mercer drafted a written summary documenting the conversation and sent it directly to HOA counsel for record purposes. Again, documentation. Always documentation. 3 days later, the board made their biggest mistake yet. Without notifying me, HOA contractors entered the southern easement corridor with excavation equipment and began widening portions of the roadway shoulder near the damaged drainage area. Not repairs. Expansion. They cut into adjacent ranch land beyond the legal easement boundary, trying to create temporary traffic bypass space around the unstable shoulder. One of my trail cameras captured everything. Excavators crossing survey markers, workers removing boundary stakes, fresh grading nearly 12 feet outside authorized access zones. I drove out there immediately with Mercer already on speakerphone. When I arrived, the contractors stopped work almost instantly after seeing the survey pins and legal maps in my hand. Most workers understand when they are standing inside someone else's lawsuit. Denise arrived 20 minutes later, furious that operations had been interrupted. But this time, Mercer handled the conversation directly over speakerphone while I stood beside the road. His tone stayed calm, cold calm. He informed the contractors they were now participating in unauthorized land alteration beyond recorded easement limits after formal notice had already been served. Then he said something that changed the atmosphere completely. From this moment forward, every additional minute of activity exposes the HOA to expanded damages. The equipment shut down immediately. By sunset, Mercer had filed for emergency injunctive relief in county court, And for the first time since this started, the possibility of closing the road became very real. The emergency hearing happened 4 days later. By then, the situation had spread across the county. Residents packed the courtroom gallery. Local reporters filled the back rows. Even neighboring ranchers attended quietly, mostly because landowners pay attention when easement disputes start making headlines. The HOA arrived with 3 attorneys. I arrived with Mercer and 6 storage boxes full of records. That visual mattered more than people think. One side came with arguments, the other came with evidence. The judge began by reviewing the immediate issue involving unauthorized excavation beyond the easement boundary. HOA counsel argued the additional grading work was necessary for public safety because of the unstable roadway shoulder. Mercer agreed the road required repairs. Then he calmly demonstrated how the HOA ignored every legal procedure required before entering private property outside the easement limits. Survey maps appeared on courtroom screens. Photographs followed, then trail camera footage. The video showed excavation equipment crossing clearly marked property stakes while workers removed boundary markers from the ground. The room became very quiet after that, especially when Mercer introduced the certified notices proving the HOA had already received repeated warnings about unauthorized expansion. The judge looked directly at Denise Harper several times during testimony. Her confidence was fading visibly now. But the hearing became far worse for the HOA once the maintenance records entered evidence. Mercer walked the court through 6 years of deferred drainage repairs tied directly to the roadway easement obligations. County engineering reports confirmed neglect repeatedly. Insurance correspondence confirmed prior liability warnings. Then came the financial records. The courtroom screens displayed HOA budget allocations diverted toward cosmetic projects, while infrastructure maintenance was postponed year after year. Decorative fountains, clubhouse renovations, landscape redesign contracts, all while the drainage systems beneath the only access road deteriorated. Residents in the gallery started whispering immediately. Some looked shocked, others looked angry. For many homeowners, this was the first time they realized the board had hidden the severity of the infrastructure problems. Then Mercer introduced my grandfather's archived memorandum from 1984. The judge read portions silently for almost a full minute, especially the sentence warning that temporary accommodation should never be interpreted as permanent public access. That document destroyed the HOA's implied access narrative almost instantly, because it proved prior owners explicitly rejected broader public usage decades earlier. By afternoon, the hearing no longer looked like a dispute between stubborn neighbors. It looked like an HOA systematically exceeding legal authority while neglecting contractual obligations attached to critical infrastructure. The judge issued temporary restrictions that same day. No recreational use beyond the recorded roadway easement. No unauthorized expansion activity. No organized access onto ranch property. And most importantly, any future roadway work outside existing easement boundaries required direct court approval. That ruling hit Cedar Hollow like a bomb. Residents leaving the courthouse were furious. Not at me anymore, at the board. Local reporters surrounded Denise near the courthouse steps asking about ignored engineer warnings and maintenance spending decisions. She refused questions and left quickly. That night, community forums inside Cedar Hollow exploded with accusations, leaked budget screenshots, and demands for emergency HOA meetings. Board members started blaming each other publicly. One resigned before the week ended. Another reportedly threatened legal action against Denise personally. The structure holding their authority together was cracking fast now. And once organizations start collapsing internally, they usually expose their own worst secrets without help. 2 weeks after the hearing, Mercer received anonymous documents in the mail. No return address, just copies. But whoever sent them knew exactly what mattered. Inside the envelope were internal HOA emails, maintenance reports, and meeting summaries stretching back several years. Most involved discussions about the roadway easement and drainage problems. One message from Denise stood out immediately. In it, she warned another board member that acknowledging infrastructure deterioration could strengthen the ranch owner's leverage over future access negotiations. Another email discussed delaying culvert repairs because reserve funds were needed for clubhouse renovations before upcoming property tours. That single decision likely contributed directly to the road collapse. But the most damaging document came near the bottom of the stack, an internal legal memo from the HOA's former attorney. The memo explicitly warned the board that expanding recreational activity beyond the roadway easement could jeopardize their legal position if challenged in court. The attorney advised immediate enforcement against unauthorized trail use years earlier. The board ignored him. That changed everything. Because negligence is one thing, knowingly ignoring legal warnings is another. Mercer immediately moved to authenticate the documents through discovery requests. Within days, the HOA attorneys were forced to confirm most of the records were legitimate. Panic spread inside Cedar Hollow after that. Homeowners demanded emergency financial disclosures. Residents started questioning where HOA dues had actually gone. Some worried property values would collapse if the road dispute escalated further. Others feared lawsuits. And they were right to worry. County officials also became more aggressive once the internal documents surfaced. Infrastructure inspectors returned to evaluate additional sections of the roadway easement corridor. Environmental compliance officers reviewed runoff damage near the creek crossings. The reports kept getting worse. Meanwhile, the board fractured publicly. 3 members resigned within 10 days. Denise stayed, but barely. People who once defended her now openly accused her of arrogance and concealment during community meetings. Residents recorded arguments on their phones. Videos leaked online. Local media stations returned to cover the growing controversy. The HOA tried rebranding the situation as a historic misunderstanding regarding shared land use. That phrase lasted less than 48 hours. Because Mercer filed the formal lawsuit right after. The complaint was massive. Trespassing, unauthorized land alteration, breach of easement obligations, infrastructure negligence, property damage, liability exposure, interference with agricultural operations, and finally, a petition requesting judicial review of the HOA's continued roadway access rights under material breach conditions. That last part terrified everyone. Not because the road would necessarily close permanently, but because the possibility now existed legally in open court. For decades, residents assumed the roadway was untouchable. Now judges, reporters, county officials, and homeowners were all reading the same contracts, realizing access depended on compliance all along. I still remember driving through the valley that week. Everything felt different. The same luxury homes stood beside the lake, same landscaped entrances, same paved streets, but the illusion of control was gone. People were finally seeing the foundation underneath their community. Paperwork, agreements, boundaries, and decades of ignored obligations. That realization changes how communities behave very quickly, especially wealthy ones. Because once privilege collides with documented reality, panic usually follows close behind. The court proceedings lasted almost 7 months. Most people imagine lawsuits as dramatic moments inside crowded courtrooms. Real property litigation is slower than that. Depositions, engineering reports, financial disclosures, endless document reviews, quiet pressure. That is how large legal cases are actually won. Mercer approached the lawsuit methodically from the beginning. He was never interested in emotional victories or public humiliation. His focus stayed narrow: contracts, compliance, documentation. The HOA, meanwhile, kept trying to frame the case emotionally. Their attorneys argued that restricting roadway access could harm innocent residents who had nothing to do with board decisions. Mercer agreed with that point repeatedly. Then he reminded the court that my family never threatened lawful access. We challenged unlawful behavior tied to the easement agreement itself. That distinction mattered enormously, because judges care about precision. During depositions, former board members started turning against each other almost immediately. Once personal liability became possible, loyalty disappeared fast. One resigned treasurer admitted maintenance reserve funds were redirected multiple times, despite engineer recommendations. Another testified that Denise frequently dismissed concerns about easement restrictions because she believed the ranch owner would eventually cooperate under community pressure. That statement became part of the official court record. So did the ignored attorney memo warning against unauthorized recreational expansion. Then came the engineering testimony. County infrastructure specialists explained how years of drainage neglect weakened the roadway foundation gradually. Photos showed erosion spreading beneath sections of asphalt long before the eventual collapse. One engineer testified the damage pattern was consistent with prolonged deferred maintenance despite visible warning indicators. In simple terms, the HOA saw the problem coming and ignored it. The courtroom atmosphere shifted after that. Before, the case felt complicated. After the engineering testimony, it felt obvious. Mercer then presented my grandfather's archived records in full chronological order: easement amendments, maintenance correspondence, access limitations, signed memorandums dating back decades. Every document reinforced the same principle: limited access, conditional rights, no recreational expansion, no public conversion. The HOA attorneys struggled badly against that paper trail. At one point, they attempted arguing that long-standing community behavior effectively expanded practical usage expectations over time. The judge interrupted almost immediately. "Behavior does not supersede recorded agreements," she said. I still remember Denise's expression when those words landed, because deep down, that was the entire foundation of their strategy. Act entitled long enough and eventually entitlement becomes normalized. Except courts do not operate on normalization. They operate on evidence. Outside the courthouse, Cedar Hollow continued unraveling publicly. Homeowners sued the HOA board separately over financial mismanagement and declining property values. Insurance carriers reviewed coverage limitations tied to infrastructure negligence. Real estate listings inside the community started increasing rapidly. Nobody likes uncertainty attached to access roads, especially expensive homeowners. Through all of it, I stayed quiet publicly. No interviews, no social media statements, no public attacks. That restraint frustrated some people. A local reporter once asked why I never tried humiliating the HOA after the documents surfaced. My answer was simple. This was never personal. It was contractual. That sentence spread further than I expected, probably because it was true. The board wanted a power struggle. I wanted compliance. And eventually the difference between those two things became impossible for the court to ignore. The final hearings took place in early spring. By then, Cedar Hollow Estates barely resembled the confident community that first tried expanding onto my land. Emergency HOA meetings stretched late into the night. Residents argued openly with board members during recorded sessions. Legal expenses had drained reserve accounts faster than anyone expected. And Denise Harper looked exhausted every time she entered the courtroom. Mercer stayed disciplined until the very end. He never overreached. That mattered. Some attorneys get emotional once momentum shifts in their favor. Mercer did the opposite. He narrowed the case down to a simple legal framework the judge could enforce cleanly. The HOA materially breached the easement agreement. They failed mandatory maintenance obligations. They exceeded authorized access boundaries. They ignored repeated warnings. And they attempted unauthorized expansion onto private ranch property despite formal notice. Every argument returned to those points. Nothing else. The HOA attorneys made one final attempt to preserve broader access rights by arguing the roadway served essential public reliance interests for dozens of homeowners. The judge acknowledged the concern directly. Then she asked the question that effectively ended the case. Why did the board continue exceeding recorded easement authority after receiving legal warnings? Nobody answered clearly, because there was no good answer, only arrogance. The ruling came 3 weeks later. I read it alone inside my grandfather's old office. 47 pages, precise, methodical, direct. The court ruled overwhelmingly in my favor. The HOA was found in material breach of the easement agreement due to infrastructure neglect, unauthorized land use expansion, and repeated trespassing violations after formal notice. The judge issued permanent restrictions limiting usage strictly to the original roadway easement terms. No recreational activity, no trail systems, no community expansion rights, no organized events outside recorded access boundaries. Then came the section that changed Cedar Hollow permanently. Due to repeated contractual violations, the court authorized temporary suspension of non-emergency roadway usage until the HOA completed mandated infrastructure repairs under county supervision. In simple terms, the only road out could legally be restricted. Mercer immediately clarified emergency access protections with county officials. Ambulances, fire services, medical emergencies, and essential operations remained protected under temporary supervised access arrangements. But ordinary, unrestricted community use ended immediately until compliance standards were met. County barricades appeared within 48 hours. Traffic checkpoints followed. Construction oversight crews monitored every repair phase. Residents suddenly experienced what conditional access actually meant in real life. Long inspection delays, restricted traffic windows, heavy construction routing, mandatory infrastructure compliance. For months, the HOA had treated the easement like ownership. Now they understood the difference. The financial consequences became brutal. Special assessments hit homeowners hard. Insurance disputes multiplied. Several board members faced personal legal exposure connected to ignored engineering warnings and budget decisions. Denise resigned before summer. Then the state licensing board opened an ethics review connected to her conduct as an attorney during portions of the dispute. I never followed the outcome closely. At that point, the victory already felt complete. Not because the HOA lost, because the boundaries finally became respected again. The fences stayed closed, the trails disappeared, the creek crossings emptied, and for the first time in years, the valley became quiet. The repair process lasted most of the summer. County engineers supervised every stage personally. Damaged culverts were replaced, drainage channels were rebuilt, erosion barriers were installed along vulnerable sections near the southern curve. For the first time in years, the roadway was actually maintained according to the original easement standards. Not cosmetic upgrades, not decorative projects, real infrastructure work. The HOA had no choice anymore. Court oversight changed everything. Every invoice required documentation. Every repair needed inspection approval. Reserve spending became transparent to homeowners after the financial disclosures during litigation. Residents who once ignored board meetings suddenly attended all of them. Funny how accountability creates civic interest. Meanwhile, the atmosphere around the ranch changed completely. The trespassing stopped almost overnight after the ruling. No more hikers crossing cattle fields, no more unauthorized trail markers, no more yoga classes near the meadow or bikes cutting through maintenance roads. People respected the signs now, not because the signs changed, because consequences became real. I replaced several damaged fence sections during that period and upgraded gates along the southern boundary. Mercer recommended reinforcing every access point clearly to prevent future disputes. So I did. Steel posts, new locks, fresh survey markers embedded deep enough that nobody could casually remove them again. I also restored parts of the creek area damaged during the unauthorized trail expansion. Native grass returned slowly through the summer. Wildlife patterns stabilized again once foot traffic disappeared. The valley felt like itself. Quiet, ordered, honest. One afternoon near the end of August, an older Cedar Hollow resident stopped beside my outer fence while I was repairing wire near the south pasture. I recognized him vaguely from earlier community meetings. He stood there awkwardly for a moment before apologizing. Not dramatically, just sincerely. He admitted many residents believed the board's version of events for years because nobody questioned the HOA leadership publicly. Most assumed the ranch would eventually work something out with the community the same way previous owners always had. I told him something my grandfather used to say. Kindness only works when people still recognize boundaries. The man nodded slowly after that. Then he left. That conversation stayed with me longer than the court ruling itself, because it explained the entire conflict better than any legal filing ever could. The problem was never access alone. It was entitlement growing slowly through years of unchallenged accommodation. People stopped seeing permission as generosity. They started seeing it as ownership. And once that mindset takes hold, boundaries eventually disappear unless someone restores them. That became my role whether I wanted it or not. By early fall, most of the legal disputes surrounding the roadway were finished. The easement remained active under its original terms, but now every condition attached to it was enforced precisely. County inspections became mandatory. Maintenance schedules were documented publicly. Any proposed changes required formal approval and recorded notice. Exactly how my grandfather designed it decades earlier. Cedar Hollow also changed internally after the lawsuit. A completely new HOA board took control before winter. Several residents pushed for reforms limiting board authority and increasing financial transparency. Community meetings were no longer quiet formalities where leadership decisions passed without challenge. People asked questions now, carefully, especially whenever property rights were involved. Property values eventually stabilized too, though not before several homeowners sold and moved away during the uncertainty. New buyers entered the valley with a much clearer understanding of the easement restrictions attached to the community. No one talked about shared ranch access anymore. The illusion was gone. As for me, life became simple again. Most mornings returned to fence repairs, cattle checks, and quiet drives through the timber roads before sunrise. I spent less time in conference rooms and more time rebuilding neglected sections of the ranch that had been tied up in the dispute for nearly a year. The southern meadow recovered slowly. Grass covered the old ATV tracks. The creek banks stabilized after restoration work. Deer returned near the cottonwoods once human traffic stopped moving through the area every weekend. Peace always comes back eventually when pressure leaves the land. One evening I stood beside the South Ridge overlooking Cedar Hollow while the sun dropped behind the western hills. From that distance, the subdivision looked calm again. Just lights near the lake, small roads winding through trees. Normal. Most people driving through the valley now would never know how close the entire community came to losing unrestricted roadway access completely. But I knew. And so did the people who ignored the agreements protecting that access for decades. The lesson was never complicated. Ownership matters. Boundaries matter. Documentation matters. And contracts signed long ago still carry weight long after confident people convince themselves otherwise. My grandfather understood that. Now Cedar Hollow did too.